I actually did not know when we originally scheduled this that I would be the first talk, so I am going to do my best to make that something that I live up to. And I do think it's a particularly relevant talk for this audience, just given what we're talking about in terms of creating new post-web principles. I want to sort of talk about the history of existing cryptographic movements, and in particular, what we can sort of learn from the cypherpunk movement, which has sort of been lost in a lot of the conversations recently, especially with Web3. And a lot of the motivation for that movement was very well summarized with this paper, which is actually the title of the talk, by Philip Rogaway. And what it states essentially, just to distill it down for folks, is that cryptography actually rearranges power in the sense that it configures who can do what, from what, and as such, it is sort of this inherently political mechanism to distribute essentially private or secret information. And unlike other technologies, I mean, if you use, let's say a toaster, you're not really doing that as a group in a community. Cryptography is naturally a social technology. It is something that we are using together in conversation with each other, and that we are using pretty consistently to protect ourselves and others from powers that be. And in this way, actually, cryptography is historically a resistance movement and historically used for resistance in ways that I think we often sort of forget. So one of the ways I want to talk about is just in revolution. So the Ionian Revolution is one that people don't talk about a lot, but it was over 1,000 years ago. And essentially, BCE, so actually over like 3,000 years ago. Essentially, it was a way that people used the earliest forms of cryptography to pass messages in order to make sure that they could actually start the revolution, in this case by getting a message from Hystasius to his sort of good friend Aristagoras, who convinced him in turn to start the revolution. And these were sort of first attempts to use cryptography as a way to fight power that were not really available before. It used this idea of a cytail, which is actually a physical object that you can see there, which kind of was the preferred method of cryptography at the time. There were not computers, obviously, so it was pretty difficult to do anything much more complex. And the goal of these sorts of tools was very much just to, again, try to preserve secrets for preservation of resistance movements. And in the Abbasid Revolution, similarly, to overthrow the caliphate of the time and actually instantiate, for the first time, the Malawi with sort of first-class citizen rights, there was a similar sort of tool that was used. This was actually what was originally not given a name, but eventually described as the art of cryptanalysis by Al-Kindi. So this is actually an existing form of cryptography that is still kind of a predecessor to existing forms we use today. And in particular, it was sort of used in this case to try to pass messages in a similar way to the Ionian Revolution between members of that revolutionary class. But in addition to revolution, it's used cryptography historically for actual, knowledge management and sort of the preservation of religious or otherwise sort of scientific tradition. And in particular, there's two examples here that I think are really cool. One of them is actually the Alchemical Renaissance, which during the time of the sort of English courts, Elizabeth I and the Bohemian courts, there was a sort of roving band of folks who actually sort of had their own moving castle of sorts, which is where the sort of term moving castle, and if folks are familiar with Ghibli, Howl's moving castle comes from. And they were sort of this roving band, John Dee and Edward Kelly and others, that were trying to predict what alchemy might be used for in the future against the will of the existing sort of aristocracy. And they were able to sort of secure their secrets and their practices and maintain them while also working within the establishment by having tools like sort of substitution ciphers, anagrams, and so forth to actually avoid that kind of scrutiny and maintain this conversation between each other across various different kingdoms and various different locations. And similarly, this is probably one folks are more familiar with, Galileo actually used cryptography pretty actively in, for example, communications with Kepler in order to share discoveries before eventually the church decided to or eventually found him out and decided to place him under arrest until his death in 1633, 10 years after that. And this was, of course, because at the time, things like Kepler's and Galileo's work was viewed as heresy under the Inquisition. So these are all examples of essentially resistance in various forms. The type of resistance is not actually really the important piece here, but I think these are particularly relevant examples because they show us that things that we actually care about even today were actually protected by cryptography in ways that we did not really, or at least even in my view, I was not like fully aware of, until I actually went deeper down the rabbit hole. And so why is it then that we sort of have this history of using cryptography in these ways? And we have this history of a cypherpunk movement where we view cryptography as sort of a tool for the people, a means of restoring digital autonomy and so forth, as sort of Timothy May and others in the 1990s sort of, I think, perhaps most famously identified and as people in this audience are probably most familiar with. Why is it that if we have this history that we've sort of lost this potential and we have sort of gone from the cypherpunk movement through to now, of course, the Bitcoin white paper and the sort of genesis of why a lot of us are here in terms of tools for resistance for information and value respectively, to something like this, which is essentially narcware in its truest form. And I really don't have a good answer for this, except that I think we've sort of lost the plot of the movement that we were trying to build. And I think in some ways, if you look back, the way in which this movement has actually evolved is not really necessarily surprising if you look back to the original sort of mission and vision of the term Web3 as Gavin Wood defined it back in 2014, where he referred to a sort of post-Snowden web as a sort of philosophy of decentralized, dynamic, consensus-driven information, basically, in a way that it would be, I think, characteristically similar to or in alignment with the ideas of decentralization as we know them, but not necessarily in alignment with the values of privacy and overall sort of, I think, freedom that we care about. And this is something that I think is fundamentally a problem because we're using this term, and applying all these ideas to it without necessarily having the background or the sort of political will to use it in a way that leads to the outcomes that, as Stellar mentioned, we're sort of looking for from something like a post-web movement. So to me, we're sort of losing the future in part because we're not really fully recognizing the past of the cryptography that we've been using. And the Web3 movement is not in its current form actually leveraging the real sort of properties of cryptography and sort of values of cryptography that the cypherpunks were able to actually articulate. So what should we actually do from here? Well, we should actually be pretty mindful of two things. One is that movements like Web3 tend to accelerate. They are very, very good at attracting more people. There are a lot of incentives involved in attracting more people. And these create problems like the ones that David Chapman identifies in this piece, which is pretty famous at this point, called Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths. Essentially, subcultures attract very interesting people. As they attract more people, especially without norms and boundaries that are strongly defined, those people tend to extract from the space. And then as that extraction occurs, the energy and sort of value of the movement slowly dissipates. It's sort of like a hollowing out of the movement over time, which I do believe has sort of happened with some of the principles that the space sort of started with today. And then alternatively, you actually have the opposite problem that can occur, which is that you have movements that slow down or don't grow fast enough and essentially fade into irrelevance. And I think this is somewhat true of the decentralized web movement. The Internet Archive has sort of spun up and I think done a good job of sort of keeping at pace with their own communities, but haven't really scaled beyond their own local sort of local communities. And this is also true of like open source movements where maintainers burn out all the time and essentially lose track of their ability to build the project due to a lack of resources or otherwise. And so this is a huge problem, especially in a high inflation information ecology, because essentially if you're standing still, if your movement is not like scaling up and growing, you are essentially being red queened out of existence, just meaning that like other high acceleration groups are sort of taking over more space and eventually capturing the movement anyway. So you have this problem on the one hand of growing too fast and essentially being captured one way. You have the other problem of moving too slowly. And I think both of these things kind of happen to some of the historical movements we're talking about, even in the cypherpunk era. And so I think with that in mind, like what I'd like to suggest is just really very practical in the context and of this sort of post-web movement and in the context of this group. Because I do think that we can define sort of values and principles that bring the sort of like people here together with a clear objective. I think Stellar's already done a great job of that. I think that we can sort of define flexible norms and rituals. It's kind of like what we're all doing here today with autonomous ecologies. And then we can sort of define these polycentric systems of rules, a la Elinor Ostrom, who was a famous sort of scholar of commons, who won the Nobel Prize for this work in 2009. And Ostrom's sort of goal here was just to identify what would we want to actually do in order to make a commons type ecosystem sustainable over time. Well, we want to make sure that there's sort of local rules that can centrally grow outwards in order to make sure that anyone who's participating in the ecosystem is able to understand them, so they're legible, and they can be sort of changed and iterated over time, and they can be enforced with sort of graduated sanctions over time. And then we want to actually, and this is maybe the most controversial one, forward plan to some degree with what we're doing. And I say this because each sort of iteration of a movement is, I think, one step in a much larger civilizational arc. We sort of have these series of death and rebirth cycles where movements constantly come and go. And I think, we're sort of at a very good point here where we've realized that Web3 is in this position and done something to capture this that I think is relatively important and useful at a time where I don't think it is necessarily too late. But it's very possible to end up in a position, 5 years, 10 years down the road where it is too late. And just being aware of the fact that movements have these life cycles and being aware of the fact that we need to be planning for how to keep these values alive and pass the torch consistently, I think, is an important thing to be able to do. So don't do these things. This is actually from the CIA manual for basically disinformation / interference with organizations. And essentially what it says is, what a lot of movements fall prey to, which is they insist on, not doing anything. They insist on, only talking at great length. They insist on bringing up irrelevant issues or haggling over wording or referring back to things that we've already decided. And so I think just being aware of this and being able to build a movement where we all sort of can come together rather than being pulled apart is really important. So basically we should build some form of anti-capture into the movement, ways to resist the urge to infight or fragment, ways to bring people together rather than create conflict, funding from a wide range of sources instead of just from one large source. This is actually a major problem even for open source organizations like, say, Mozilla, which gets the majority of its funding from Google and therefore is pretty well beholden to them. And then be fundamentally prefigurative. We should build things, which I think everyone here will be talking about in their own way, rather than trying to restructure or break or look backwards at old systems. And so, therefore, this is the only time I will, even myself, be looking particularly back at these systems rather than trying to continuously build something new, which is ultimately what we're now sort of ready to do with public works. And we want to be able to figure out ways to build these anti-capture mechanisms into new projects as they're created rather than risk the sort of constant sort of down the road capture of these projects as has happened sort of historically. So I'll just end with a statement that I think probably resonates with this group and is important for me. Privacy is a human right. It is not something that is part of the original sort of Web3 movement necessarily, but it can be something, and is, in fact, I think, even pretty much at the very start of what is part of the post-web movement. So I am very excited that we are starting to think about these things and build a new movement around these ideas. I know this was a little bit of a TED Talk, so I just made sure to say thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And I really just appreciate everyone being willing to build on this movement. Thank you.